Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Chris Cervanek, the Associate Director at the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Kevin Bales. Before I do that, though, I need to thank the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies, which is co-sponsoring Professor Bales' visit. So, many of you in the room have read Kevin Bales' work, have watched his movies, his videos. As you know, he is an extraordinary activist and scholar. His scholarship broke open the world of human trafficking to us in the 1990s, explaining in ways that had never been explained before how slavery was still in our midst and was growing post-globalization with... And he explained the different kinds of manifestations, and suggested responses to modern slavery. He wrote the book Disposable People, New Slavery in the Global Economy in 1999. I know I teach that in my class. I see a lot of my students here. Professor Candido teaches it in her class this semester. I'm sure a lot of you come from her class as well. And it's still educating, in multiple editions later, generations of students and scholars. He is the professor of contemporary slavery at Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation at the University of Hull in the UK. And many of you have probably read his other publications, which I highly recommend, such as Ending Slavery, How We Free Today's Slaves, and The Slave Next Door, Human Trafficking and Slavery in America Today. And then he's also this fantastically effective activist. Utne Reader calls him a visionary who is changing your world. He's co-founder of Free the Slaves in the U.S. And there's an excellent TED Talk that I recommend to you from 2010 with over 750,000 views. So he's in our midst. We're so fortunate to have him. Fortunate that he was in the neighborhood and that he's spending the semester at the University of Chicago as a visiting human rights professor. And he has given us a most enticing title for his lecture, Modern Slavery, Ecocide, and the Secret to Saving the World. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bales.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks very much. You can hear me okay in the back, I think, with this mic. Okay, great. And look, I just want to be completely honest. 750,000 views of my TED Talk, but 268,000 I viewed myself, and for one, and then Utne Reader, changing the world, but they didn't say for the better, right? They just said changing the world, and so it was apparently a debate among the editorial staff there about good, bad, I don't know, hard to say. The somewhat bald and almost crazy title for this talk about the secret to saving the world. This is actually all about my new book, and it's a book you can't buy because it doesn't come out until the end of late January, but it's about the research that I've been involved with, a very large project. It's been a global project over the last 7 years, and I'm not going to give away much more besides that. I'm just going to tell you the story about that, but that's but I do want to say that it was my publisher who changed the subtitle of the book to read Modern Slavery, Ecocide, and the Secret to Saving the World. I find that a little bit of a reach because it's a secret at least until January 19th, maybe, when the book comes out. But the Saving the World part, I mean, that's a lot of weight to put on a guy, right? But if it works out, great. Maybe then Utne Reader will say, changing the world for the better, right, and so forth. Here's what's happening with that story. What's happening with that research? It's this. For just at 20 years now, I have been studying people in slavery, studying slavery around the world. And the work that led to Disposable People and all of the other books that I've written about contemporary slavery are primarily based on field work and being in those places where people are in slavery, talking with people in slavery, talking with people who have just come out of slavery. Whenever I can, talking with slave holders. I want because I want to hear their side as well, and so forth. And it meant that I've been around the world doing that. And, that's just a picture. I'm walking around in the Congo. I'm down in a deep shaft mine where slaves are mining gold in Ghana, and I have been focusing all these years, though, really on those people in slavery. And so often, it'll be someone like this elderly woman who was, well, she wasn't that elderly. I think she was in her late 50s, but she was nearing the end of her life, and the reason she looked so distraught was she was explaining to me that her master, she was a hereditary slave in a hereditary form of slavery in northern India, and she was explaining that her master had just told her to leave the tiny hut that she lived in, and she'd lived in her entire life as a slave to that family in a quarry, and he was saying, it's time for you to just go. And he was basically throwing her into the gutter to die because she was no longer strong enough to be an effective enslaved worker. What I'm getting at there, though, is that I focused so strongly on the people in slavery that I realized over time, began to miss a lot of the context. And it was actually only after I would be back home and I would be looking at slavery around the world, and I would be looking even at my own photographs, that I would be thinking about, wow, so this was the story with this person in slavery, but when I look at the picture of where they are, there's something else going on there. Now, my work is also, I just put this up for those of you who may not be as familiar with contemporary slavery. This is from another part of my work, which is the statistical work on the Global Slavery Index, which you can find on the web. It's an annual publication about how much slavery there is. And as you can see, there's slavery all around the world. There's no country on this map that you can see that doesn't have slavery. There are a few tiny island nations with no slavery, and it used to be when I would talk about this, I would say, well, there's slavery in every country in the world except Iceland. And then one day I said that in a talk, and a woman put her hand up in the back and said, I'm a member of the Icelandic Parliament, and we have it too. And I realized I need to stop thinking there was any place that was potentially free of slavery. But you can also see that there's a lot of slavery in the poorest parts of the world, and you can see that our very conservative estimation of how much slavery there is in the world puts us at the moment at about 35.8 million people. And I'll come back to that number in a moment because that number is important. This is the background part before I get into the new book part. We know there's about that much slavery, or we estimate about that much slavery at the time, and I want to be very clear that though you've been talking about slavery in your classes, so this is not a new idea to you, but that slavery is what slavery has always been. There's sometimes a sense among the broad public that there are different types of slavery which are radically different to the past. And the answer is, yeah, there are different types of slavery. In fact, there's been probably maybe 1,000 types of slavery over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years in different parts of the world and in different formats, and whether it's driven by politics or religion or gender or conquest or trickery or capitalism or pre-capitalism or legal forms or illegal forms. There's been lots of types of slavery around in the world, but fundamentally the slavery is always the same. The slavery is always about one person completely controlling another person, using violence to maintain that control, and then using that control to exploit them, economically, sexually, in whatever way they choose. But total control of an individual, using violence and coercion and threat to maintain that control. That is the state of being in which a slave lives. And one of the things that confuses us sometimes is the fact that you have that point, in a sense, the core of slavery, which I'm showing you with my little hands together in a ball, but that we've got that core of slavery, but then you package it. Everywhere in the world, they take that state of being called slavery, and then they wrap it. This isn't slavery because this is legal, but this isn't slavery because those people are from that tribe. And that's okay because people in that tribe are like children and they need to be cared for and they also need to be disciplined. This is okay because this is a girl. And girls, as you know, in our culture are not necessarily considered full human beings. So we can do, the packaging gets wrapped and wrapped and wrapped. But once you unwrap that packaging from whatever cultural or religious or political or concept that they use to conceal, rationalize, and justify that enslavement, you get down to that state of being where one person is completely controlled by another. That's been true throughout human history. The one thing that's different, and if you've been reading Disposable People, you already know this, so I'll go very quickly, is just to say there's this one thing that's different, which is that in the last 40 to 50 years, there's been a collapse in the acquisition cost of what it takes to bring someone into slavery. And I think nothing shows that better than this particular clip from Bloomberg.
Okay, lively discussion guaranteed here as always as we get macro and talk commodities. Continuing here in the studio with our guest Michael O'Donoghue, Head of Commodities at Four Continents Capital Management. And we're also joined by Brent Lawson from Lawson Frisk Securities.
Happy to be here.
Good to have you with us, Brent. Now, gentlemen, Brent, where's your money going this year?
Well, Daphne, we've been going short on gas and oil recently and casting our net just a little bit wider. We really like the human being story a lot. If you look at a long-term chart, prices are at historical lows, and yet global demand for forced labor is still real strong. So that's a scenario that we think we should be capitalizing on.
Michael, what's your take on the people story? Are you interested?
Well, definitely. Non-voluntary labour's greatest advantage as an asset is the endless supply. We're not about to run out of people. No other commodity has that.
Daphne, if I may draw your attention to one thing, that is that private equity has been sniffing around, and that tells me that this market is about to explode. Africans and Indians, as usual, South Americans, and Eastern Europeans in particular are on our buy list.
Interesting. Michael, bottom line, what's your recommend?
We're recommending to our clients a buy and hold strategy. There's no need to play the market. There's a lot of vulnerable people out there. It's very exciting.
Exciting stuff indeed. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Okay, that wasn't really Bloomberg. A couple of people were looking at me though. What's this guy? That's actually a spoof. I just thought I'd put that in there for fun. Thank you. There's someone in the back who was about to leap to his feet and say, no! But in fact, I like to put that up because it in a sense tells us what we would be seeing on television on the Bloomberg channel if in fact slavery were still legal. That's exactly the kind of discussion we'd be having about the collapse in the cost of human beings. If we look at it in a chart form, it looks like this. If you look over the last 4,000 years and you work through the cliometric economic historical way of measuring different price ratios, fundamentally you get this measure, which is that for most of human history, slaves have been capital purchase items. They've been major investments. The average cost over time is, for an average slave, is in today's money somewhere around $40,000 to $45,000. And then, but with the population explosion that's occurred since the early 1950s, late 1940s, there's been this collapse. And you can quickly understand that it's a supply and demand price collapse. That when you create a very large number of very vulnerable people, and in a sense there's a glut of enslavable people on the global market, it means that the acquisition cost is much lower. You don't have to transport them long distances. You can actually pick them up in their local area and so forth. If you look across history, you can see this demonstrated really easily in the Deep South before the Civil War, where we have phenomenal records of slaves and how much they cost. And you know that at that time an average slave was a 19-year-old agricultural worker, so a young guy who could swing a hoe, but not much, didn't have special skills. An average 19-year-old agricultural worker slave in 1850 cost between $1,000 and $1,200 $1850. And $1,000 to $1,200 $1850, it could also buy you a house in 1850. It could buy you several hundred acres of land, or it could buy you, interestingly, 6 oxen. But remember that 6 oxen were like tractors. That was like buying 3 tractors. So we're talking about a significant capital purchase. Today, if you look across the world, you see that the average is around $100 in terms of acquiring a person into slavery. Often it doesn't even require a purchase. It's just the cost of tricking this person, right? Some meals, a bus ticket, a ride in a car, and other things that can help you bring that person under your control. And that cost can be very low indeed. In the United States and in Western Europe, again, we know that acquiring someone into a situation of slavery will usually cost low thousands of dollars, but low thousands, $3,000, $4,000. But in places like rural India, you can bring a family into a situation in enslavement and debt bondage for $10 or $20. Often, sometimes, just the amount of money needed to buy the necessary medicine to save someone's life, for example. But for which there is no other collateral except to put up their own family. Okay, that's a background that I wanted to just put out as we begin to then explore how that turns people, that very low acquisition cost turns people into not capital purchase items, but disposable people. So that people become more like styrofoam cups. Things that you buy at a low cost to use that you can crumple up and throw away. These young guys that we filmed in Nepal are children who are being used to carry paving stones down from the mountainside. They're carrying more than their own weight. They're lured into this. The acquisition cost is between $10 and $30, but they're lured into it with promises to their parents that there'll be legitimate work. Then they're taken to a completely different part of the country. Then they're put to work in this quarrying and hauling. But when one of these boys falls down, one of them falls off a ledge, one of them breaks their ankle, the slaveholder simply walks away. They just leave them on the ground because it costs less to go and acquire a new child than it does to even bring them to medical care. So they have become disposable inputs in a stone delivery system, right, for that. Now I will tell you, these children are no longer in slavery. We filmed this just before liberation work was taking place, but I have to say for every kid you saw there, there's hundreds who are still in that kind of slavery in Nepal. That quarrying work, which I've looked at in several places in different types around the world, was one of the first clues that I had about the whole point of this new work, which is about the relationship between slavery and environmental destruction. So I've seen families like this, children, men, women, the whole group, enslaved, often hereditary slaves in parts of Asia, doing this work in quarrying and stone breaking and so forth. And I even began to find situations like this. Now, a very brave and wonderful anti-slavery worker named Supriya Awasthi took this picture when she tricked this slaveholder into showing off his quarry and his slaves to her. And that picture alone makes it, just the fact that it's a slaveholder showing off his slaves just a few years ago is shocking enough. But not only was it that, and I hope you can tell sort of, down in the lower right part of the picture, you see small children digging and chipping and so forth, and then dads up in the upper left who are cutting away the bigger blocks and so forth. But it's whole families, and these slave families belonged to his father before him, and his grandfather before his father. But here's the thing: one of the things about this picture, as I began to research this picture because it was so powerful, was I realized this is a protected national forest. This is one of the protected national forests in northern India. This shouldn't have any mining in it. And it certainly shouldn't have mining which is absolutely destructive like this, where they're not just removing the trees, they're removing the topsoil, they're smashing it all to pieces. And then when they play out a particular part in the quarries, they just walk away. There's no land reclamation or anything. There's no taxes paid. This is completely illegal, but he does pay a bribe to make sure that he can go and quarry in this protected national forest. I began to look other places. Here's Ghana. This is in a protected forest area in rural Ghana, in a place that's supposed to be a wildlife endangered species park. This was once a river flowing through a beautiful tropical forest. It's now what looks like a war zone where open cast gold mining has been going on. The enslaved women and children that you see on the left side of the screen are actually hauling big pans of sand, mostly sand, which has gold flecks within it that will be removed through washing in 1849 gold rush style. But what's worse is not only did they destroy this river to the point that it doesn't even work as a river anymore and have destroyed the forest, but this is everything that you can see here and for quite a distance in all directions is saturated with mercury. Saturated with mercury because mercury is how you remove gold flecks from sand and from other types of solutions where you can draw the gold out. Mercury bonds with gold, and then you burn off the mercury, creating mercury vapor, which is if you happen to stand there when it burns off, it will kill you. But it saturates with mercury. I walked down this to the right. It was actually downstream. Even though the river had stopped, there was still a bit of a stream about a quarter mile away where they hadn't dug. I then followed that for another quarter mile, and I was in a village. And I was in a village where people were watering their vegetable gardens from that stream. They were boiling the water to cook with, but their animals were also drinking the water. And there was even a church where they were baptizing people in that stream, completely laced with mercury. It was pictures like that and pictures like this man and people that I got to know. This is a man that I met in Ghana, but now in deep mines, not open cast mines, but deep shaft mines, down in deep in the earth in medieval conditions, where only bits of wood and the only technology in these gold mines was the flashlight that was put to the side, that they strapped to the side of their head with rubber bands. That was the only technology beyond primitive chisels and primitive hammers. Everything else was baskets, hammers, and chisels, so it was all handwork. It would have been recognizable in ancient Rome as a gold mine, or the Middle Ages. He's dying of silicosis because when you smash quartzite into a fine powder, the silicon dust fills your lungs and you can die of that. The largest ever occupational death toll in the United States was a silicosis poisoning of a whole lot of mainly African American workers during the Depression who were asked to dig a tunnel through a mountain in West Virginia, but they ended up digging through quartzite without any protections, and about 170 men died of silicosis within a 5-year period. Some people get silicosis today in the United States, but it takes about 25 years to die of it if you have a little bit of exposure to silicon dust. These chaps die of acute chronic silicosis within 18 months because they're breathing thick clouds of silicon dust daily, and it scars out your lungs, and you basically drown inside as you live. Now, while destroying the environment and saturating with mercury, I begin to ask, as I keep seeing these things, what if there's actually a link between slavery and the use of slaves in environmentally destructive ways that is large enough that we can treat it and consider it as part of the overarching enormous challenges we face in terms of species loss, destruction, and climate change. So that was the key of the research that I started 7 years ago, was to go back to the countries I'd worked in, mostly in looking at slavery and looking at how those two things fit together. So I'm going to start by doing something 3 times in a row. I'm going to start with a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the Sundarbans at the bottom of Bangladesh. And it's a World Heritage Site. It's supposed to be protected according to world law. And I'm going to start out in space for a moment. And I'm going to do this 3 times. I'm going to start up high and I'm going to zoom down low, and then I'm going to start up high and zoom down low, just so you won't get disoriented or get seasick or airsick or something like that. So, why is this a UNESCO World Heritage Site? Because the Sundarbans forests is the world's largest mangrove forest. It's on a whole series of islands and coastlines at the bottom of India, Bangladesh, Burma, and so forth. It's a vast area. It's the largest carbon sink in Asia. So this is the place that's soaking up carbon as opposed to expelling carbon, right? This is a carbon sink. It's cleaning the air. Right? It's also the home of a whole series of endangered species. So it was set aside 30 or 40 years ago as a World Heritage Site to be protected at all costs. And yet, as you can see on the right side of the screen, there's a forest, but on the left side of the screen, there's something else going on. And what's going on there is a fish processing camp in which the workforce are child slaves. The little lines that go out toward the river are actually walkways, and the little dots near the river are boats which have been bringing in fish, and then they're hauling the baskets of fish up into this other space. And you'll see that those are not buildings necessarily that you're seeing there. They're drying racks that look like this. Drying racks covered with fish, drying food for both internal markets to sell to people to make fish soup and all kinds of things, but also for some of this gets exported for cat food to places like the United States. I'm not saying your cat is a bad person. Cat people are kind of touchy, right? So I just want to get that on the table right away, right? It's just what I said. But children are lured down with promises of work. Their families are lied to. They're taken down, and then when they reach there, they find themselves in horrific situations of abuse. This is a remarkable picture taken by a Bangladeshi colleague of mine of a slave driver beating children as they work the racks. It's hard to find, access to see the kinds of images that we have of 19th century slavery today, but occasionally you get it. These children are scrambling around. They're not working fast enough. He's out there with a long stick, beating them and beating them. The work is terrible. They work 24 hours straight, 36 hours straight, because they have to work as fast as the fish come in. And if the fish are coming in at that rate, they have to just keep working all night. They sit on the ground, they cut, slice, they're covered with fish guts, they're cold, they're wet. And sometimes if they have time off, they're sexually assaulted as well. So there's that in addition to all the other. Now, when I spoke to 3 of these boys who I had the amazing and coincidental experience that I was in a town very near this island, a little tiny village. There were no roads. I got there by boat down at the very bottom of Bangladesh. And in the morning when I woke up very early, there was actually a boat pulling in, and these children had stowed away in a boat, in a fishing boat, and managed to escape, one after more than a year, one after 6 months on the island and so forth. And I was able to chat with them the morning after they escaped from one of these islands like this. And I talked to them, and there's something here that really illustrates this intersection. I talked to them about what was life like there, and I was saying to them, for example, what health concerns did you have? Were you sick? What was the worst part of things? Because they were saying we were beaten, we were sexually assaulted, these things. But they said, in terms of our health, diarrhea was the biggest problem. They said we all had diarrhea about half the time, and we all know kids who died of diarrhea while we were on the island. And I said, okay, diarrhea, number 1. What was number 2? What was the second most? And this is the part that I have to say shocked me and still continues to shock me. Every child that I spoke to said that they had either seen or knew a child on the island who had been eaten by a tiger. Now, that fact alone is grotesque and horrifying, but it's also indicative of the fact that the UNESCO World Heritage Site is set aside not just to protect the mangrove forest, but to protect the Bengal tigers, for whom this is their last viable habitat for Bengal tigers. This is supposed to be preserved because these are a special endangered species. And when the slaveholders have pushed into their space, they have in fact pushed children into the space of Bengal tiger territories and replacing the deer that were their prey animal now with children. And subsequently, every child I talked to who had been on an island talked to me about being attacked by tigers, being terrified of tigers, losing their friends to tigers. Where do we go with this? Well, I'm not saying your cat is a bad person, but the products that are generated through this process, all across the bottom of Bangladesh and India, and also in the shrimp farming, which is a slightly different way that this is being accomplished, and forest loss is being accomplished through converting forests into shrimp farms. It goes into shrimp, it goes into our shrimp salads, it goes into cat food, it goes into the stuff that does flow up. In fact, every bit of the work that I found in which environmental destruction was tightly and positively part of large-scale enslavement was supported by its flow into the global market. Let's start all over again. What if places that I'd worked before in brick kilns, in Pakistan, for example, with slavery in brick kilns, what if that was part of this environmentally destructive process? Here's a brick kiln, again from the sky, one that's a little harder to fathom. But you see this giant oval, right, shape. I put in a diagram to show how a giant brick kiln works. And there's a person in there, I put in a scale so you can see the scale. It's actually the track around a football field, and it burns in that oval, and the fire burns its way around 30, 40, 50 times over a usually a 6-month period, as wet bricks are put in front of the fire, dry bricks and fired bricks are removed behind the fire, and then the children and adults who work in the brick kilns are actually stacking them or stacking them, and then constantly feeding the fire as it moves around this oval. Now, the children who work there and the adults who work there are normally families. Whole families tend to be enslaved. And if you've read Disposable People, you know the chapter of Pakistan where I spend time in brick kilns, and you get to know people who are enslaved as entire families there. But you have children and adults working in this huge number of brick kilns. But the part, of course, when I was there studying people in slavery, that in some ways I missed and didn't quite grasp was the level of pollution that was rolling out of these brick kilns. I talk about it a tiny bit, but more about the danger of the fires than the danger of the pollutions. Because the key problem here is that what is the major fuel of brick kilns? Leave aside that I did some calculations on what I knew about fuel consumption in brick kilns, and I got to 2.6 million tons of CO2 per year for the set of brick kilns. Leave aside the CO2 emissions. The primary fuel of brick kilns is used motor oil and used car tires, automotive tires. Now, if you know anything about environmental disaster, you might know that in the United States, if a fire breaks out in a pile of old tires, that counts as a Class 1 environmental disaster, which brings out EPA regulators instantly because it's considered to be that dangerous, both in terms of the gases that are released, which are highly carcinogenic, and in terms of the bits of the tires that turn liquid and flow into the soil, which are highly carcinogenic and desperately polluting as well. These are completely unregulated, unfiltered, unstopped, but with human beings to pour the stuff in and then to release it into the surrounding communities. It's also that black soot that comes out of the stacks, which is the kind that's more dangerous in terms of its greenhouse effect than just plain CO2. And where do those bricks go? They're going into the building booms of South Asia, right? All over South Asia, you have these enormous building booms going on in Mumbai and the big cities. There is some slavery we know in the brick kilns of China, which has also been fueling their building booms. They're not on a building boom. They've stopped their building boom at the moment, but it's just a pause. We don't know how much in China because they won't let us in to really look, but we know it's happening there too. What about the Amazon? What if it was happening there? Well, when I went back to the Amazon, to where I'd worked in the past, focusing on slavery, but focused on slavery and environment. I'll start it again with a picture from outer space. This was actually taken by an astronaut with a camera out the window of an orbiting spacecraft. These are fires along the Xingu River. That's the Xingu River that you can see there. The Xingu is up in the Amazon. It feeds into the Amazon, but it's supposed to be a completely protected area. The land around the Xingu and that part of the Xingu was set aside in the 1970s as what they called at the time, I think, Indian reservations, but fundamentally it was for tribal peoples who lived in the Amazonian area where the immense tracts of land were set aside as the property of these indigenous peoples. The fires are not them. The fires are criminals who are knowingly violating those boundaries and using enslaved workers to clear and cut. Now this map is a little tricky to read, and I'm sorry to show you a tricky one, but when I explain it, you're going to understand why I wanted to put it up. If you look at the very top, you'll see that purple river. That's the Amazon. That's the Amazon itself, right? So that little that thing that looks like tributaries is the Amazon itself. The green areas are those areas of the Amazonian forest which are still intact. So that's part of the Amazonian rainforest, which is still rainforest. The yellow parts are those areas of the rainforest which have now been cut, slashed, burned, and shouldn't be. So they're on the boundaries of the violet part, which in fact were not protected forest, but the yellow parts are where the protected forest has now been cut. Now, the dots, the blue dots, are slavery cases. And the bigger the dot, the more cases there are. So that if you see a little cluster, I can't use a pointer here, but does this have one? Right there. That big dot means there's something like 40 to 50 individuals who are freed from slavery. But the red dots are known murders. So those are known slavery cases, of which we only know a portion, and known murders, of which we only know a person. And I think the key point here is that if I draw the line of the semicircle in the disappearing areas, the frontier of the Amazon rainforest, what you can begin to understand is that the scythe, the blade of the scythe, which is cutting down the Amazonian forest, the sharp edge of that scythe is murder and slavery put together. And I think few things illustrate it quite as well as this work. This is a work from a group called Reporter Brazil, which is an amazing investigative and technical journalistic group. Where does all that go? Well, some of it looks like this when you're on the ground. This is in fact very strangely reminiscent of the picture from Bangladesh, only on this time it's the right side of the screen where you see a clear-cut forest, on the left side where you see the forest still intact. But now instead of fish processing, you see a whole lot of little dots in a row. Those are ovens where the wood that has been cut down on the right side of the screen has been brought to burn in the ovens to produce charcoal. And I'll zoom down now so you can see in the background behind that enslaved worker, you can see the clay ovens, which are sort of this big, in which they are burning the timber of the protected forest to make charcoal, so that Brazil can export that charcoal, not to make barbecues, but so that they can use it in their steel industry to convert iron ore into steel, because they don't have any coke or coal the way that we do in this country to convert iron ore into steel. So they use wood charcoal to do it. And then that steel gets exported, a lot of it to North America, a lot of it to Western Europe. This was one of the most chilling parts for me, and it also takes us back to the notion of disposability. I guess you could call this CSI Amazonia, but the team that I followed had finally got a tip-off on where the bodies were buried of slaves who had been murdered, and we were able to go into the woods after some 2 to 3 years after they had been murdered. They were, again, classic example of young men hungry for work, landless peasants, promised a job, taken far out into the forest, worked day and night, destroying protected forests, burning it into charcoal, sometimes selling some of the timber as well. And then at some point, these 3 bodies in that grave, because there was a survivor from that group, related the story, and that's why they'd been looking for the grave, related the story that they had said to the slaveholder, the criminal slaveholder, "We're sick of this, we're really tired, we're sick, we want to go home." And he said, "Fine, just follow me, we'll go and we'll get you home." And he walked them into the forest and shot them all in the head and buried their bodies, thinking they would never be found. This at least these 3 were at least found. And this is where that steel goes. Plumbing fixtures and car parts. For the most part in North America, this is the use of Brazilian steel, is plumbing fixtures and car parts. So the next time your cat tries to turn on I don't want to go there. Now, when I'd been around the world working through all these different scenarios in which I was finding slavery was being used as a key way that the environmental destruction, species loss was going on, and I was also able to begin the calculations, especially working with UN RED, which is the part of the UN nobody's heard of because they work on forestry, but they calculate deforestation rates in different countries and so forth. And I was working with their data to calculate up how much of deforestation was leading to how much CO2 emission that would be part of the whole process of climate change. And the fact that I came to from that analysis, and again, I only work conservatively with stats. I always lean on every equation to the low side of whatever range I get when I work through. But the factoid that came out of that in a sense encapsulates this whole project is this, that if slavery were a country, it would have the population of Canada. If slavery were an American state, it would have the population of California. If slavery were a country, it would have the GDP, the gross domestic product, of Angola. So we're not talking about a rich country here. If it were a state, it would have the GDP of Kansas. But if slavery were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of CO2 after China and the United States. It's larger than any other European country. It's larger than any other country except China and the United States. Now, at 2.5, and these figures are actually old now, 2 or 3 years old. I think it could be different and this could be altering, but it wouldn't be altering dramatically. At 2.54 billion tons of CO2 per year, the idea that that's coming from slave-based criminal activities suddenly alters how we might want to think about climate change, environmental activism, human rights activism, and economic activism that has to do with either the environment and human rights. I'm going to back off for a second and say, because there's something very interesting about contemporary slavery. There's a paradox, in a way, about contemporary slavery that when you fit it together with those CO2 levels begins to make things happen. And that's this. 35.8 million people in the world in slavery. That sounds like a lot of people. It is a lot of people. It absolutely is a lot of people. But, and here's the paradox, 35.8 million people in slavery is the tiniest, smallest fraction of the global population to ever exist in slavery on the planet Earth. In a world of 7.2 billion people, to have something like 36 million people in slavery is by far the smallest proportion of the world population enslaved. Likewise, we think there's about, according to the ILO, about $150 billion per year generated from slave work into the global economy. 150 billion, that's a lot of money. I think that's about the endowment of Notre Dame. No, it's not. Okay. 150 billion is a lot of money, but in global terms, in a global economy that some people would put at around 12 trillion, it is really a drop in the ocean. I mean, you could really think of it as a drop in the ocean. 150 billion doesn't sound like a drop in the ocean, but is again, in the same and parallel way, the smallest fraction, the smallest part of the global economy ever represented by slave labor. So we actually have this crime which has been reduced to a tiny part of our global social existence. It's illegal in every country. It's rejected by all religious groups except ISIS. It's seen as morally reprehensible by virtually every human being on the planet. And in many ways, slavery, because of its criminal nature and because of its fractional nature, has really been pushed right up to the edge of its own extinction. Though we don't tend to think of it that way. We see it as this insurmountable problem. But globally, in terms of its size and weight, it's right on the edge of its own extinction and just needs a good hard push to get rid of it. And I think that the part of this that's most exciting is the idea that a good hard push to end slavery also begins to open a door to reducing and possibly even reversing the effects of CO2 and climate change. That the 400 ppm that we're at the moment, 400 and something ppm globally of parts per million of carbon, that we need to get down to 350 to achieve the stability of a world where we won't have sea level rise and glaciers, everything melting, might actually be possible by simply enforcing laws against slavery. Now, but how do we get people out of slavery? Is that even possible? Well, yeah, we actually know a lot about that. The last 15 years has been around the world filled with projects and people who are analyzing carefully how to bring people out of slavery and to do so in an efficient way. We know how much it costs, for example. That's a hereditary slave family in northern India. Grandpa, dad, kids, they were all born into slavery to the same family, which had been keeping also the great-grandparents and so forth. But when that community came out of slavery and they began the process of reintegration and rehabilitation, the amount that was needed to care for that family over the 3-year period of that rehabilitation was about $300. It was cheap because, A, it's northern India, where we're talking about rice and lentils, where they don't need any fancy medical, but it's also because it was a whole village doing things at once, so it wasn't about working with a single individual, it was working with the whole village. That little boy was rescued from slavery on a fishing boat in Lake Volta in Ghana. The cost of finding that child and then taking them to a rehabilitation center and helping them in that center for 6 months as they found their parents and searched out where they had come from and prepared for the rehabilitation process was about $600. The U.S. government says if you want to think about helping someone who's been freed from human trafficking slavery in the United States, you need to be thinking at least around $30,000 because you've got expensive medical care, expensive legal, expensive job training, tuition fees, all that kind of stuff. But most of the people in the world in slavery don't live in the U.S. They live in those countries where people are poor, where economies are small. And if you begin to add all up together according to what their average costs would be, and say how much would it cost if we could get to all the people in slavery, how much would it cost to bring them out of slavery, it is something like $18 billion at something like $500 per slave, averaged out over the world. Now, I actually think it's going to be more than 18 billion. I think we might hit 25 billion because it's going to take 25 years to go through that entire process. But, well, movie tickets sold in the U.S., right? It's not that far off on what we spend in blue jeans in a year, right? I mean, there are individuals who could bankroll this, literally. There are individuals who could actually write a check for that much money. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't need to come from individuals. It needs to come from governments because they've already passed the laws that say slavery is illegal. And it doesn't have to come all at once because it's a 20 to 30-year period that it would take to do all that work. So that if you spread it evenly across countries according to, say, their GDP, it would be pocket change, kind of peanuts, right, in terms of what it would cost to make that happen. Now, I want to say we know how this works out because I wanted to share some happy things out after all that sad stuff, and just to say, little boys like this Gabriel guy who went off to the rehabilitation center, and people sometimes ask me, how can you work on this stuff? It's so depressing. Well, look, this is what I get in my email as a report. It's like, hey, this is what happened last week when all the kids were finished their 6 months and their moms came to get them. Right? Children who had been lost to slavery, reunited with their moms and dads, ready to go home. And going home with them would be job training for the parents to make sure that they were attaining the kind of economic stability so they would not be, and the public education about trafficking so that they would not be tricked again into letting their kids go into what they thought was a good situation, which was actually a very bad situation. This man, James, we'll call him, not his Brazilian name exactly, but was a landless peasant. There are a lot of landless peasants in Brazil. He was at one point enslaved and forced to destroy forests. He was dumped, injured and ill, but he did manage to connect with an NGO later up around the Xingu that was also linked to the main Catholic human rights group in Brazil. And they helped him to apply for a government grant of land because the government does not sequester require complete hands-off treatment for all forests. What they do allow is for landless peasants like this in some areas to take blocks of between 100 and 200 acres of forest with the requirement that they can only cut trees in 3 to 5% of their block. The other 95% of their Amazonian rainforest they have to manage. And by manage, they mean harvesting the natural fruits of the forest usually maybe planting needful plants that are indigenous to the area, like cocoa. Cocoa trees come from the Amazon. There's also a very famous tree called Pernambuco, which, does anyone play a string instrument like a violin or a cello? No one? What happened? This is a musicalist outfit. Bass viol? Viola? Okay, anyway, the reason I'm saying that, I figured somebody would. Almost all the bows for all those orchestral instruments are made from the special wood of the Pernambuco tree, because it's the one that gives you the beautiful sound. And you wouldn't think of orchestral musicians being radicalized about the environment, but they are all over the world. Orchestras are organizing today to preserve the Amazon because it's the only place you can get Pernambuco, and it's about to disappear. And they're looking at a world without perfect instrument sound. But you can plant them inside the forest. You can't grow them on a farm. You have to plant them in the forest. They have to live in the forest to make it work. You can see he's happy. He's got new boots. He's got clothes. He's got a motorbike. He's got a house with a roof. He's got a refrigerator. His kids are all in school. None of them have to work. They're learning to be like middle class kind of people. And when I was talking to him, the thing that had blown his mind was that the month before, he and his wife had done something that they had never dreamed possible, which was they took a trip to the seaside just to go. And he was just still boggled by the idea that you could actually just have a holiday, right? That this was possible in the life. But you can imagine, as a landless peasant, he'd literally lived in dirt burrows for a while. All that behind him is cocoa grown on his farm. He didn't realize until we talked about it that he was actually growing organic fair trade cocoa. No, really, he just thought he was growing cocoa. He didn't know it was organic because he used no chemicals. He did it all naturally and so forth. But he was kind of excited about that, especially when I told him there was a premium. So the point of all this is to say this. There are a lot of ways to get people out of slavery, and we know what they are. We know what they are. It depends on the type of slavery people are in, but we know efficient ways to remove people from slavery around the world. And we also know there are a lot of ways to save the environment. Sometimes it involves letting people be within environment in a respectful and careful way, like that chap in the Amazon. But there are other ways as well. And there are ways even to put back open cast mines so that they can be put back into reclamation can occur. What's going on here is that what I think this work demonstrates is that there's a potential win-win. That if we think about environmental reclamation and we think about slavery and we begin to address them together, they can work. And here's just one example. Reforestation. This deforestation that's been going on has not been legal timbering. It's not that at all. In fact, one of the sad things is that environmental regulations which brought in forest protections drove legal timber work away from most forests around the equatorial belt and fundamentally opened up a vacuum into which stepped criminals using slave labor who said, I'm not going after those farm trees. I'm going after the guerrilla forests where the natural preserves are, where the really big old trees are. And that criminal slave-based deforestation is why it's so much more destructive than just regular timbering. But as it turns out, if you look at the amount that slave labor has been forced to cut in the last decade, and you think about if these people were freed from slavery and given the opportunity at the normal rates of pay to reforest those same areas, and then you sold the work that they were doing on the global carbon credit market, and I appreciate there are some concerns about carbon credits as a way to address global warming, but if you were using it to bankroll reforestation by employing freed slaves, when I calculated up that much replanting at the current rate on the carbon credit market, it generates $68.5 billion. Now, I don't think you could do the whole forests, but even if you did half, you'd still be at a number higher than we think it would cost to free all the slaves in the world anyway. And it's already happening. So let's go way back to one of the early pictures, and this is where I quit, to say there was those families enslaved in a quarry in a forest where their master was pointing at them. Those families came to freedom in time through a community organizing model. We always call it the Obama model, right? The community organizing model of liberation of communities. And what did they want to do when they got free? They did what I have to say every community I've ever worked with that's ever come to freedom. Number one, even before they want food, they want schools for their kids. And they will do anything to build a school, get a teacher, to get the kids out of the workplace, because they believe that if their kids can learn to read and write, everything will change. And it's true, everything will change. The second thing they want is a lot of food, because they're hungry, and they're often physically ill because they're malnourished. The third thing for these people, they wanted to replant the forest. They said, some of us remember when the forest was here. And now it's all been destroyed. We've been forced to make this happen. And one of the things they said to our organization was, can you get us trees? And we actually reached out, and curiously, it was the World Bank who said, we have a bunch of trees in India that we can put in a thing. And they gave us, I think, 8,000 trees to hand over to these folks. And they knew exactly which trees they wanted, because Gandhi, in fact, has written about the 5 trees that every village should have. I always get confused by this. I don't know their names in Hindi, but it's because they do, it's all about the letter F. Food, fuel, fodder, fiber, and fruit? Dog food? I don't know. I'm not sure what it is, but there are these 5 trees that are used that every village wants, because they can sustain a village and so forth. I stopped the film just there to finish up, because you see the man with the kind of slightly more Western dress. The reason I wanted to point at him is because that's the forest ranger that was receiving the bribes from the criminal slaveholder to turn a blind eye to the loss of his own forest. And now he's standing around watching ex-slaves replant his forest. But I can tell you what the elderly woman is saying who's standing next to him. We got our eye on you, buddy. And they made it clear, right? They weren't necessarily going to bust him. They understood that corruption was endemic, that taking bribes is what happens. But they said, this is not going to happen anymore. And we're free now, and you're going to be the guy who protects our forest, like your job description says, or you're going to answer to us. That's that cycle that could lead to ending slavery, ending climate change, changing climate change, changing slavery, and so forth. So that's what it's all about. What if it all meant we could make it happen, right? What if it could actually do that? This is what the new book looks like. It's available. You can pre-order now if you choose to. But just so you'll know what it looks like, you'll be hearing a lot about it at the end of January and early February. And so thank you so much. I think I'm 5 minutes over, maybe? But take it 2 or 3 questions. Don't even clap. Just go straight to the questions. Yeah. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Well, this is just so impressive, and how very nice that you end with positive. Don't you get so discouraged. But as a person who works with languages, I was really intrigued. How did you communicate with great variety of tribal people?
Well, I only work with interpreters, right? And I have to. People will say, "How do you do your research?" And I have to say, number one is finding the right person to work with. I have to find that special fixer interpreter person who's highly sensitive, and often it takes years to find the right person. Yeah. Though I have a great network of anti-slavery organizations, for example, who are made up of indigenous peoples, that they're often usually able to help with that. What's another question? Yes, sir.
Say the financial resources are available to free the slaves. Are the other resources available to do that?
No. I mean, in particular, the reason I shouted out no is because the shortage that I can see right on the horizon is that we've been discussing this morning is trained personnel who know how to do anti-slavery direct intervention and reintegration and rehabilitation work. if you took every anti-slavery worker who knows how to do that well, in the world today you would probably add up to a low hundreds. I'm not necessarily talking about, you have a lot of people in the United States and different service providers, but we can't just pick them up and put them down in rural India, right? So globally, we've got a real personnel shortage, a real human resource shortage. Yes?
Considering how cheap it is to enslave people, how does taking people out of slavery reduce the total number of slaves prevent them from just taking out people?
Well, that's a perfectly reasonable question about if you take people out of slavery, what's to prevent slaveholders from taking people into slavery? It depends in part on the types of slavery we're talking about. In those communities, those slaveholders live in those communities as well. Once those communities have become not just slave-free but slave-proof because people are organized, they don't let slavery happen in that space again. But you have to have a community-based approach to almost all types of slavery, because once a community says, we don't allow this in our community, it begins to create the political economy of liberation and freedom and respect, as opposed to a political economy that allows people to enslave. So you're right, it's tricky, and it's right that some have to be punished, and prosecutions are very low around the world of people who are criminal slaveholders because the resources are so small that most money gets spent on rehabilitation work and reintegration work, not upon prosecution work. So it's an important one, but it's one every anti-slavery group is constantly working to make sure that the people who are creating the crime, committing the crime, are discouraged as much as possible. I have to tell you, that group in that village, well, the last time I was there, I was with some of them, and they were talking to me and through my interpreter, but I noticed they were saying the word NGO, which I didn't know they knew this thing. And what they were saying was, we started an NGO. We started an NGO. I don't think they knew what NGO meant, like the acronym, what it spelled out to, but they were saying we have an NGO. And my interpreter said, now they have an NGO. And I said, well, that's fantastic. What is your NGO? What have you done with your NGO? And they said, we got all together and we found the old slaveholder and we beat him up. I said, well, okay. That may be like step one. I don't know. I think we should talk about strategic planning techniques, maybe cost-benefit analysis, like that. But so sometimes, people come to freedom and are able to be sufficiently empowered. I mean, when people come to freedom, if you do it right, they're getting basic education. They're getting rights education, legal education, right? So that they can become citizens. And once they have that rights education, legal education, citizenship education, they understand this isn't legal. We can't do this. And then when you provide them with economic autonomy, a way to become economically autonomous, they have a stability, along with their citizenship and their education, that they can resist crime, right, in a way that a person who's illiterate with no base can. The other thing that you always work on in that process is about mental dignity and care and health and other kinds of health. That's harder to measure. Last question? Yes. Oh wait, you're a teacher. Students something. You a student?
Yes.
Okay. You sure? Let me see your ID. No. Okay. Go ahead.
I wonder if in your research you find out the connection between transnational corporations and slavery, modern slavery, that is not monitoring enough supply chains, like a direct relationship or something like that.
Students always want to find that direct connection between multinational corporations and slavery on the ground, but I got to tell you, it doesn't usually work that way at all. It doesn't mean that they're not connected. But the slavery on the ground is committed by criminals who operate in the local area and who are just dirty with the crime. And they do everything they can do to conceal the origin of whatever that commodity is. Now, that's why it's crucially important that you buy that book when it comes out. And the reason why I say that is because one of the things I do in that book is, particularly for the Congo, is that I spend a part of the book tracing some of the minerals that are being acquired through slave labor in mines controlled by armed groups in the eastern Congo, and I follow those minerals all the way up to your cell phone, right? And I explain how at each step there are clouding and hiding mechanisms going on to confuse the people who ultimately make that cell phone and confuse the people who are making the components for it. That's not to take away their responsibility, but it's to point to the fact that they don't have culpability, they have responsibility. And that there is levels of culpability where people know that they're involved in this, right? And their responsibility, if they've been aware of it for a long time, is beginning to blend into culpability. But there's also a zone of guilt. And the guilt is on the criminals that do the enslavement and on the people who support those criminals by knowingly buying their products and their commodities or concealing it or taking bribes around it. So you have levels of, you have the crime and then you have the accessory after the fact and so forth. You have those levels of guilt. But then you cross this into this space where it may not be legal guilt. It may be just very blatant culpabilities. And then you cross other lines that take you into a space which is it culpable or is it just responsible? I am responsible for this. And of course, the other part of that line is that it ends up, guess where? With every single person who buys, who is also part of that chain of responsibility. And we have to be very careful that we don't get caught up in that adolescent notion that there's a moral watershed that occurs at a cash register, right? That somehow, when I buy, the people are dirty, they're dirty, Gap is dirty, everybody's dirty until I buy the T-shirt. Now I'm clean, but I have the right to be. I have the right to have righteous indignation because all those people are bad and I'm now good because I own this T-shirt that I've been forced to buy from Gap because it's got slavery in it. And, that's not the way it works. They have to say, I'm not as responsible as Gap, but I hold this much responsibility because I bought the T-shirt. I went there, I got the T-shirt. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Professor Bales, please join me.